Oh, it's so good to see you. It's so wonderful to be with you. And we're going to just cover about 40 years today. And we're going to try to do it in about 45 minutes. How about that? All right. Let's go to God in prayer. Wonderful God, we thank you that you have invited us into this day. You have literally rolled out the red carpet for us. You've made it possible for us to be in this place around tables with friends. And we bring ourselves, our whole selves, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're here before you, God, to open our hearts and our minds to not only learn, but and not just to understand, but to be engaged in this grand drama and history and this sweeping narrative of your relationship with us and all the ins and outs and the way we as human beings have been formed and transformed by your Spirit. I pray a blessing on each person here today for whatever they bring, whatever challenges they're facing, whatever hardships, decisions, and we celebrate whatever joys and the wonderful things that happen in life as well. And God, I do pray a special blessing on each of their small groups, that they will be engaged with one another, that they will have listening hearts and be tender. And so, God, we lift this day up to you and we thank you. Amen. All right, so you know that we just cover the highlights, and it's up to you to get in between the cracks and all the stories that go into this. And that is especially true of this particular study because it's so demanding of time when we present it to you, but the real study, the real effort comes from your engagement in small groups and also your personal engagement with reading the text. So in the last two sessions, we've been focusing on the covenant that God made with the people of Israel. And that was a covenant that was made for you will be my people. God gives them the burden and the joy and the privilege and responsibility of becoming God's people who are going to go out into the world to create a community that will embrace the entire world so that the entire world will come to know God. Yeah, that's in essence the long-term ness of this particular covenant. But in the meanwhile, God says, but I'm going to give you a promised land, many, many children, grandchildren, and so on, and your name will go on forever. And so those were some of the promises that God made. But the most important promise was, I will be your God, and I will be with you, and I will go with you in wherever you go. So we discovered that God made and renewed that covenant with Abraham and then with Isaac, Jacob, and all of their ancestors on down to the new covenant that was created with Christ. And we read that God remembered that covenant and led the people out of slavery in Egypt. But in our lesson today, that covenant, that part of the covenant is fulfilled. And the people are returning to the land that was promised to them promised to their ancestors. So during the journey, there are certain covenant responsibilities that are for the people that are spelled out. And these responsibilities are ways for them to begin that shift, that transition of what kind of community they're going to be. Who are they going to be? And it just happens to be that 10 of these were given. Can you guess what those were? Yeah, the 10 Commandments. We call them the 10 Commandments, but the Hebrew text speaks of them as the 10 words from God. The 10 words that establish the conditions necessary. Okay, get that. These commandments establish the conditions that were necessary for a free, loving, and just community of God's people to develop and to flourish. So in other words, what God is saying in these particular responsibilities is that if you want to be a free, just, and loving society, just listen and obey my word. And these are laid out for you. Those three adjectives, free, loving, and just, are basic to community as a whole, not just to this community, but community in general. And they remain pretty basic to our Judeo-Christian values and faith today. But I think it's also important to remember that following Jesus is living a life that's reflected in these laws, that Jesus is the embodiment of these responsibilities. If we want to live a just, loving, and free community, following Jesus will allow us to be a part of the living law that continues, because Jesus is the fulfillment of this. And the law could no longer be diminished or chiseled away to become less than it was by human interpretation as a set of instructions to modify behavior. That's not what law is. You can't say, well, I didn't kill anyone today. Check. I didn't steal anyone's husband. Check. I didn't lie. Check. So, because that's what happened, and that's what happens to us people. We shift our focus, and so all of these rules and regulations became a checklist of things that you needed to do in order to be in relationship with God. And God came back and said, it's never meant to be a checklist. This is meant to be an attitude in which to approach each other and to approach the world. And Jesus came and reflected that attitude. So the law began to be more important and go back to the way it was created in the first place, what it was created to be in the first place. And the law became intrinsic. And we can see this as far back as Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and all of this. And then it means the law is written in your hearts. You don't need to have a set up on the wall, because it's in your heart. You know what's best, you know what's good, you know what's right, and it's written in your heart. And it's evidenced by the loyalty, service, and obedience to God. So we just touch on a little bit of that. So the journey begins. The people have been freed from Egypt, and now they're out in the wilderness together. And we come to the book of Numbers. So the book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Old Testament. Now, what does that tell you about the fourth book of the Old Testament? What are the first 5 books? Anybody know? It's the Torah, right? The first 5 books are the Torah. Those are the first 5 books of the Torah. That means those were the books that Jesus relied on as Jesus was becoming a rabbi, to interpret the spirit and the intention of God to the people. Those were the first 5 books, were the sacred texts of the ancient Israelites. And so this book, Numbers, is the fourth book in the Old Testament. And the way it gets its name, the name that we know it by, Numbers, is that it's an early Greek translation from the Bible. The early Greek translation is called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is Greek, and the word that they translated was arithmoi. Now, can you think of another word that is associated with numbers that sounds like arithmoi? Yes, exactly. Do you know the men's Bible study couldn't get it this morning? I blame it on too early. It was too early to make that leap. But I'm like, numbers, arithma. Anyway, it's a title reflecting the census of the Israelite people. That's a major feature of the book. And this, I'll come back and revisit that in just a moment to say, why was that important? But it was later translated from Greek to English. So from Greek, it was arithmoi. To English, it's numbers. But we really don't understand the full breadth of what this book is all about unless we go back to the Hebrew translation of what that book is called. So the Hebrew translation is Bamidbar. Bamidbar means in the wilderness. That's what this book is all about. It's in the desert. The name is taken from the 5th word in the very first chapter. And it reflects the central theme of the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness after their exodus from Egypt. So when we look at that, it makes a lot more sense. It's not just about numbers. It's about the whole journey that they were going to make. It's a story of the people in the wilderness as they travel from slavery in Egypt toward the freedom of Canaan. Now, the image of wilderness is a very powerful image that's used throughout Scripture. It's used to connote a particular feeling or a particular object, a particular way of looking at something. So in the Bible, the wilderness symbolizes periods of isolation, testing, and purification. So it's not so different than what we experience as wilderness. For example, when you come against in your own life some crisis, some tragedy, something that, grief, for example, you feel a little lost. You feel that you're in a wilderness. You don't recognize the signposts that are there. So for centuries and centuries, that idea of a wilderness has been used to symbolize something, and that is the isolation, the testing, and the purification. It represents a space where individuals and nations are stripped of their reliance on the world. So in other words, in those moments when we feel in our own wilderness, that's the moments when we definitely seek God, isn't it? Because nothing else works. Because we have no place else to go. And so this symbolic experience of the wilderness, it makes so much sense that God sends people into the wilderness, little by little strips them of everything that they've come to rely on for self-reliance, so that they can continue to rely on God. And let me tell you, all these stories are filled with the way that people resist that. They don't want to rely completely on God. They don't rely completely on God. They constantly are testing that and pushing back. Now, don't judge them too harshly. Don't we do the same thing? Don't we constantly, I don't think God's going to be able to handle this one. I better take over, I better take matters into my own hands and make sure things happen as they should. So, I want to challenge us not to judge so harshly, because these are archetypal relationships and archetypical situations that we find ourselves in still as modern people. So it symbolizes all of that. It's a place of profound divine encounters, because that wilderness, when you're stripped bare, you begin to see God in places that you may not have seen God before, because you're looking for God. Miraculous provision is supplied, and preparation for new callings, as seen with the Israelites' exodus from Egypt and Jesus' temptation before beginning his ministry. So it's bareness, the bareness of that wilderness highlights the need for God as the sole provider. God desires that we depend solely on God. Because what happens when we depend on each other? I mean, and I'm talking in the broadest sense. I'm not talking about, depending on your husband, your wife, your child, your friend, but I'm talking about when that's your soul, when that's who you solely, put all your faith in. We're human. That means we're going to fail each other. We're going to disappoint each other. And the best case scenario is that when that happens, we have grace with each other and we pick ourselves up and we go on. But God never fails. And so God is trying to teach this people that God can provide for their every need. So it leads to profound encounters and reliance on God for sustenance, direction, and peace. It's very symbolic of all of that. So in the New Testament, John the Baptist was a voice crying where? In the wilderness. There you go. Again, to prepare the way of the Lord. John spoke from the outer margins of the wilderness into a world whose power was concentrated in the hands of a few. So Jesus was tested and tempted where? In the wilderness. That's right. Everything stripped away so that you solely depend on God. And it echoed Jesus' temptation. This story of Jesus and his temptation echoes back and certainly spoke to the people who were sharing the stories of his time. Spoke to the Jewish heritage of, they heard this as an echo of ancient Israel's sojourn and testing in the wilderness for 40 years. So even the number 40 has this symbolic meaning. I mean, what we have here is we have this perfect combination of two of the most powerful symbolic words and numbers that biblical history has to offer us. We have the melding of wilderness and the number 40. The number 40 has a very symbolic meaning, symbolizing a period of, now listen to this. So when you hear the number 40 in the Bible, you recognize it may not be 40. It doesn't matter. If you can lift that idea of space and time off of your shoulders, it'll be much easier for you. But what 40 means, when you hear 40 in the scriptures, it means whatever was going on there, it was a time of testing, a time of probation, and a time of judgment. And it was also a time of transformation and new beginnings. So this is how to sum that up. What does 40 represent? It represents a full, complete duration leading to a significant event or transition. What it means is, when they say 40, they mean until it was finished, and it was completed, and it was whole. For example, Noah's flood. How long did it rain? Okay, until it was completed. Israel's wilderness wanderings. How long did they wander? Moses on Mount Sinai. How long he was up on the mountain? The maximum number of lashes that's allowed, slashes on the back, that's allowed for a crime was 40, because it represented being fully punished. David's reign, we haven't gotten to that yet, but guess how long he reigned? The number 40 also signifies a time of preparation for a new task or a change from one state to another. So we have Jesus, 40 days in the wilderness, meaning Jesus stripped bare, depending solely on God, until Jesus was prepared and ready. Jesus, the number 40 can also refer to a generation of people, because later on we will understand that by the time they got to the promised land, the first generation that had left Egypt, there was nobody left except for two people. All of the other people who were going to enter into the promised land were the subsequent generations of people. So that 40-year span represented also generational change. So it's important to look at those two symbolic meanings and knowing how meaningful this was for the Jewish story. And it's interesting because if you look at the book of Numbers and subsequent books, we know modern scholars see this as these books were put together from ancient stories around the campfires, around the dining tables, all of this stuff. These stories came together post-exilic. That means 586 BC or later. And these things happened in 1400 BC. So what does that tell you? The people who, when they were captured by the Babylonians and sent into what's called the diaspora, that means they were sent everywhere out. They were dispersed. And they were no longer a whole people. They were dispersed into all the different lands as slaves. And the question arose, who are we? What is our identity? We don't know who we are anymore. And so the writers compiled all these stories to look back at who they were. so that the people would have their history. And so when you look back at that, doesn't that make more sense why they did all the generations in the numbers, why they did all these numbers, why they did all these census, why they laid down this story of the whole story, because the people needed to know what their identity was. So Jews throughout the centuries have found a real resonance with the theme of living in the wilderness in times of exile or persecution and diaspora. So this is an important piece of it, and that is, rather than viewing this period in Israel's history as people who just didn't know how to read a map, that they could have been there, really quickly, and they just went on this circuitous route and whatever. Rather than looking at it that way, what I think what we're called to look at it, because of our understanding of what wilderness and what 40 means for the Hebrew literature, it's more important for us to remember it as a time of preparation between departing Egypt and arriving at the promised place. Preparation for what? Remember, God was putting a very big responsibility on their shoulders. They were going to carry this grand enterprise of God reconciling people to God. They were carrying it on their shoulders. So God had to work with them to transform them into a people, in spite of themselves and in spite of all that would come after that, able to carry and shoulder that responsibility into the future. It's a full, complete duration leading to a significant event or transition. So on the journey, the people who left Egypt as slaves were formed into a community of God's people. And even God's people still fail. They still resist. They still they still doubt, and all of that. That's normal and that's typical, and God is still in the process of transforming them. So in Exodus 32, we come to the golden calf. And the golden calf, it shocks and it disturbs us. This is a story that shocks and disturbs us, because if we're reading the biblical narrative, it sounds like they left Egypt one night and the next night they're making a golden calf, That's not exactly the way it happened, but there is a significant piece where they got frightened. They were out in the wilderness. Moses was communing with God, and they decided that it wasn't, and I think this is an important distinction. They didn't build a golden calf to worship the golden calf. They didn't build a golden calf to replace God. They built the golden calf to replace Moses, because they said, we no longer have access to God because Moses is gone. And so we better do something about that. So we'll build a golden calf, and then this golden calf will speak to God for us. So the fact of the matter is, the golden calf could not speak for God. The golden calf couldn't lead, it couldn't give, it couldn't act. So who was actually leading and acting on behalf of the golden calf? The people, right? There it is. There it is again. People wanting to be in charge of themselves. They don't trust God at that point. And so the golden calf was just, it was just a symbol. It couldn't do anything. So now you have people interpreting and doing all of this ritual and all of this stuff. You have people trying to lead people rather than depending on God to lead them. So anyway, that was a kerfuffle. That was not a happy time. And Aaron certainly was a part of that. I think kind of Aaron was between a rock and a hard place to me. He was down there with all the people while Moses was gone, and the people were demanding something. And I don't know, I would just suppose that Aaron said, I either, I'm with them or they're going to kill me, So he aids in that, which is also, brings about some reaction from God. So Moses comes down from Mount Sinai. He has the tablets ready to give them, but he already knows what's going on. He and God have already, discussed this. So he comes down and he confronts the people, and he metes out some punishments, but he also, destroys the tablets that he brought back. So then a new set of tablets is going to have to be made, and he has to go back up the mountain, and that's that whole second story. But meanwhile, while he's down there, he asks them the question. He says to the people, "Is God your God or not? Do you belong to Yahweh or not?" Now, not everybody said yes, but they continued to stay together as a community, although all along the way people fell off out of the community. That was called Hellenizing. That means they got to a city or someplace, and some people said, this is far enough. This is good enough for me. I'm going to stay here. And so people dropped off that way. But also, this invitation there was no coercion, there was no threat. It was an invitation. It says, who is for God? So the only people, as the scriptures say, that stepped forward and said, we are for God, was the Levite tribe. And the Levites became also the priestly tribe, the tribe that spoke for God to the people. So God decides as a punishment, and this is so interesting. I think the Bible is just remarkable in the way it calls back. And you can see how God is unchanging throughout this. Because, for example, in the story of the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve, when there's a breach made and sin corrupts them or whatever, does God stand on the porch and wave goodbye to them? Goodbye. See ya. Get out of the garden. You're no longer welcome here. I mean, God is devastated. And God says, well, we got to leave the garden. And so God leads them out of the garden and goes with them, and they still have a relationship with God. That's exactly what happens here. God says to them, to the people, look, I will lead you, I will guide you, I will form you, I will be your God, and you will be my people. But up until that point, Moses had access to God, and the people had access to God within their community in a place called the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting was something that they set up every time they stopped someplace. And then there would be a holy place where Moses could go in, talk to God, and then come back out. And then at this point, God said, I'm your God, you're my people, but I will no longer dwell among you. So Moses no longer had access, and they no longer had access to that God. Moses had to go away to God, or God had to appear in a different way. So they continued on, and the journey begins. After a 3-day journey guided by the ark, and the ark was the Ark of the Covenant, which was, it could be literal, and it could be, as I kind of shown you a picture in your notes, it could be literal, it could have been built, it probably was at some point, but it also could be metaphorical for the things that were sacred to them, the place that they kept the sacred things. Aaron's rod, some of the manna, and the 10 Commandments. Of course, it was at some point when they were taken prisoner by one of the other countries. Then the Ark of the Covenant disappeared, never to be found again. I think that's probably a very good thing, because otherwise they would be worshiping the Ark of the Covenant. They would be worshiping the manna. They would be worshiping that, and so would we. We are people who are prone to idolatry. We kind of shift our attention. I just think every time somebody says they found the Noah's Ark, and then they disprove it, I breathe a sigh of relief. I'm so glad. Or the Shroud of Turin, or the chalice of Christ that caught his blood, or the splinter from the cross. I'm just so happy, so relieved, because we will start worshiping that stuff. That will become our God. Because we even start worshiping other stuff besides God. We start worshiping our religion. We start worshiping sometimes our church building or our Bible or whatever. Instead of all of that is to lead us towards a relationship with God, and sometimes we get off the mark as well. So Numbers 11, we come to Numbers 11, 4 through 35, and guess what happens? The people complain. Now, can you imagine? These guys are there's, thousands of them on a road trip together. Can you imagine anyone complaining? Think of that. You've been on a road trip with 4 people. Isn't there a lot of complaints going on? I have been, and the kids in the back, when are we going to eat? Where's the bathroom? This is no fun, whatever. Imagine this. So they begin to complain because God, yes, they were starving at first, and then God supplied them with manna. But then they start thinking, but manna, it's so boring. We had all this really great food back in Egypt, and so that was what they usually used that. Kind of like a child with a parent, Dad always does it better than you, or Mom does it better than you, and they keep saying, well, in Egypt we had all this stuff. But God continues to listen because God is shaping them. They're His children. And so they say, this is so boring. Can't we have something different than manna? So God sends a wind and sends all these quail to them. And what happens when they get all this quail, and now they have quail and manna, and they're like, but we want stuffing. and cranberry sauce and a Jell-O mold, They continued to be discontented, and it resulted in a deadly plague. And so at that place, symbolically, the name of it is Kibroth Hatava, which means graves of craving. The people who craved more died there. So Numbers 13, this is a scripture where there is a major incident that causes a shift in trajectory for the people. So they've been out wandering. Now they're near the promised land. And so they send 12 spies. Now 12 is one of those other numbers in the Bible. We have 12 tribes, we have 12 spies, we have 12 disciples. So it's one of those numbers that means it's just enough. It's enough for what it was. So God instructed Moses to send 12 spies, one from each tribe, to explore the land of Canaan and report on the people, on the cities, and the fertility of the land. So they needed to report on all that, come back, and get the people ready to move into the promised land. All right? Now, you may be shaking your head and going, but what? I thought they, roamed around for 40 years. Just wait. The spies came back and confirmed that the land flowed with milk and honey. But 10 of them returned with a very negative report. And they focused on the giants, the strong inhabitants, and large cities, which they believed were unconquerable. They said, we don't have the forces to take these people. We cannot win this battle. We should not go. And so what were they doing? Who were they relying on at that point? Yes, they were taking their eyes off of God, and God said, I'll take you into that land. And they said, God can't do it. But 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, came back and said, oh yeah, we can do it with God. Of course we can do it. But at that moment, it was obvious that the majority's fear and lack of faith led to this great rebellion against God. And this rebellion resulted in the Israelites' 40-year wandering in the wilderness. What does that mean? What that means is they were not ready. They were not ready to carry on their shoulders the responsibility that God had for them. They were not ready, and it was going to take a lot of time and a lot of heartache and a lot of victory and a lot of defeat in order to ready these people for that. So the Israelites then reach, finally, after the 40 years of wandering, they reach Kadesh in the desert of Zin. And here it kind of marks an ending for something, because it says, here's where Miriam dies. Miriam is the sister of Moses, if you remember, and she played quite an important part as well. And she dies there, and that kind of ends an era, and the people are thirsty. They're in the desert, they have no water, and they demand water. And so God instructs Moses. God says to Moses, go and speak to the rock, and it will provide water. So Moses goes out in front of all the people. He goes out and he strikes the rock twice, and the water comes flowing out. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Yeah. What was Moses thinking? I don't know, but I can speculate. Was Moses thinking, I can do this? It's not really theatrical enough, or was Moses thinking that he had walked along with God for so long that he didn't really have to pay attention to the details? Or, what you can come up with in your small groups, you can come up with a lot of reasons why he did that. Why, in these last moments, did Moses disobey God? And so, because of that, God decrees that Moses and Aaron, because it was Aaron's staff, and Aaron was in on it with Moses, that they will not lead the Israelites into the promised land. So it's a site known as the waters of Meribah. But I think here's one of the most fascinating things to remember, that what seems like a harsh punishment. I mean, Moses led them out of Egypt, across the land. They put up with all kinds of stuff. And now he can't cross into the promised land. And I can't help but think that I think the relationship with God was the promised land. And Moses was in relationship with God. How could real estate offer any more than that? But it says that Moses went up, God called Moses to go up on the mountain, to look over the valley, to see the promised land, and then to go back and to appoint a new leader who would take the people into. Now, yes, Moses tried to argue with God and say, couldn't you just, let this go this time? And God says, no, I don't think so. This is how it's going to be. But God and Moses remained in a tight relationship, and Moses did as God instructed and went and appointed, guess who? Joshua, who was one of the two spies who came back and said, God's got this. God can do this. So they came back. So in Numbers 27, Joshua succeeds Moses and recounts God's command for Moses to view the promised land. And God then instructs Moses to appoint Joshua and lay his hands on him in the sight of the people and the priest Eleazar. So this event marks the transfer of leadership to Joshua. And it will be Joshua who will lead the Israelites in the promised land. And then we come to Deuteronomy 6. We switch over from Numbers to Deuteronomy. So now Moses is not going to enter the promised land. It's going to be Joshua that leads them. But Moses still has something to say from God. God still uses Moses. And how does he use him? God, through Moses, commands the Israelites to obey his statutes and laws so that they experience prosperity and growth in the land they are about to possess. And he says this is not a one-time event. It's a generational responsibility. This is a generational responsibility. That means extending to children and grandchildren, ensuring that the message of God's law is passed down. So this is the responsibility that Moses gives to the people gathered in front of him. The law, the word that I'm going to give you from God is your responsibility to pass down to your generations beyond you. And that is the Shema. The Shema begins like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And this is a foundational statement of monotheism. They are about to enter into a land that has many gods. And they could easily slip away back into that polytheistic mindset of a God here and a God there. And so this is the Shema. You must pass this down to your children and your children's children and on and on. And it affirms God's unique nature in the absence of the other gods. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And this is the most important commandment that of the Hebrew text. That is, it's calling for a complete and total devotion to God in every aspect of your life, mind, emotions, and actions. Incorporate it into your daily life. Wear it and remember it. I mean, they even talk about use it as a constant reminder, like having words written on your forehead. Write them on the lintel, the doorway lintel. Write it there. Whatever you have to do to remember what God has done for you. Teach it to your children and grandchildren so that God's stories and God's ways are passed on. So Deuteronomy 6:10 through 25, we have remembering your past. When God brings the Israelites into their new land with this most beautiful, I think it's just poetry. He says, when I bring you into a land filled with unearned blessings, houses that you didn't build, and vineyards that you did not plant. Meaning, he is returning them to a land that has been cherished and taken care of by other people. And now God is giving them this land back. They are warned to beware of forgetting the Lord who provided that to them. Because the passage acknowledges that when life is really hard, when life is tough, when we're hurt, when we feel defeated, we're on our tiptoes looking for God. But when life is good, when it's all copacetic, when we don't have a care in the world, when things are just going along fine, sometimes we neglect, we ignore, and we forget God. We forget gratitude. We forget to understand what God has done for us. And so it's not meant to be a punitive thing where you have to, close your eyes tight and remember every last second, because even with your own children, you don't want them to be feeling like they're walking on a tightrope of feeling everything taken away from them in a single second. But wouldn't you just love to hear from your children once in a while? Thanks. Thanks. Thanks a lot. So we have to remain vigilant, and it's not to be complacent in their prosperity. And when children ask about the meaning of God's commands, that's what the scripture says, people are instructed to tell them about the exodus from Egypt and how God kept his promises. This emphasis on telling God's story ensures that faith is not lost. Do you know that even today, when Jews celebrate Passover, and they celebrate the Seder dinner at Passover, a child asks the first question, says the first thing. The child says, "Mom, Dad, why is this night different from any other night?" And with that question, then they tell the story of Exodus. They tell them back the story of Exodus. I mean, that's kind of beautiful, isn't it? So for Christians, we have a story to tell our children as well. And so our story might be a little different. It's okay if it went back to Exodus, but we don't even have to go back that far. If a child asks us, why is tonight so different on Monday, Thursday, or on Easter, we could say, on this very night, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and he gave it to... You see what I mean? We have a memory to uphold as well. It's important for us to pass this on to our children and our children's children. Parents are to identify with the generation that was freed from slavery. We are to identify the generation that was freed from the emotional and the tyrannical slavery of sin. So we've come on a significant and transformational journey with the Hebrew people. You can imagine how many stories we haven't talked about. And only when you go back and read them will you be delighted by them. But they're shaped, the people are shaped and formed into a people that will carry God's purpose into the entire world. And the people have been challenged, and the first generation that set out didn't make it, but all along the way, they bore witness to what God could do among them. Remember that. It's kind of like, it's like losing weight. You know, you don't have to wait until the very end, till you reach your goal, to have joy about the ounces that you're losing along the way. Leave it to me to come up with a weight thing. But that's kind of how I feel, you know. It's all along the way. You're changing. You're being transformed. And even those who died before they made it into the promised land still made it into the promised land because the promised land was actually God instead of real estate. So a lot of questions arise about this next phase of the people of God. And a lot of questions and a lot of extraordinary story. So I hope that helps with, as we jumped through 40 years today. And God bless you as you go into your groups and ask each other questions and engage with the text. Thanks a lot.